Well, it's an understatement to say it was a week of controversy here in Ottawa. It began with an ovation and a recognition in the House of Commons, but then a stunning revelation and ultimately a resignation. The Ukrainian soldier who fought for a Nazi unit quickened the pulse of Canadian politics this week, and here to assess the fallout and the future is our panel of political insiders. Fred Delory is a partner at North Star Public Affairs and a former Conservative campaign manager. Melanie Richer is a senior consultant at Earnscliffe Strategies and a former director of communications for the New Democratic Party. And Greg McEachern with Can Strategies and former Liberal ministerial staffer. Okay, gang, I know you have very specific things you want to highlight about this, but I want to start with sort of a bigger conversation about where we are 1 week after all of this erupted in the House of Commons. So, Greg, let's start with you. I mean, where do you think this issue is a week in?
You know, I think about last Friday night, and as I bid Fred and Melanie goodbye out on the street in front of CBC studio, and I think all of us were probably, not the three of us, but I think everyone in Ottawa was thinking, you know, that the Zelensky visit had gone extremely well, how great it was. There's a lot of tension. I mean, the office building I work out of is also a hotel, and I could see the security increasing as the days went on last week. And, you know, over the weekend to see that story start about who was invited start to creep in, you know, I think everyone just felt sick. You know, the last thing we wanted to do was to cause some harm to Ukraine. Now, I will say this, I have heard, you know, in the last couple of days, some of the conversations that Zelensky's people want to remind us that they've gone through a lot worse. They've been called Nazis a long time. But I think it's important that we don't, you know, back down from improving this, apologizing for this. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a good note as well.
Fred, what's your sense of where things are a week later?
Well, look, I on the political sense or side of things, I think the Conservatives have been hyper aggressive on this, and it works for them in terms of, you know, we had this issue develop in front of us. It was a complete fumble by the Speaker, but the Conservatives have done a very good job of making Prime Minister Trudeau wear this. They've been hyper aggressive on this. They've been going out demanding apologies. Just an hour ago, I saw another press release come out from Conservative MPs now demanding that he apologizes directly to veterans on this issue. So it's fascinating to me how the Conservatives have become this very disciplined, focused team over the last while. And there's a good reason why we're now seeing them and have major lead in the polls, because they have this narrative they're telling. They're just pounding the Prime Minister. This issue broke on Sunday afternoon. Prime Minister didn't address the House until Wednesday. That's 4 days that the Conservatives were just punch. And it's a big loss by the Liberals.
Okay, and I know you want to highlight that a little bit more, and we'll get to that in just a second. Mel, just your quick take on where you think it is a weekend.
Yeah, maybe I'll have a different take than Fred. I think there was a bit of a lack of discipline from the Conservatives, actually. And the reason I say that is not to... I think Fred is right that they were disciplined in attacking Trudeau, but I don't know that this was a moment to do that. I think in the same frame of what happened with India the week before, we need a bit, not unity, that's the wrong word, because obviously there was a really bad mistake that happened last Friday, but this is a subject that should be worked through very seriously and very carefully. And I don't think we saw that from the Conservatives and frankly from the Liberals either this week. I think it really needed an elevated tone. And a week later, we're still talking about everything that happened in the House, but I think it needs to return to a little bit more statesman-like as it relates to these issues of foreign affair.
Okay, well, that leads us to the pick you wanted to highlight this week as a political move, right? And you singled out Peter Julian, the NDP House Leader, for how he handled this. Why do you make that pick?
Yeah, I think Peter Julian really handled this very well this week. He was the adult in the room. He came out and said this was unacceptable. You know, we understand that a mistake was made. We were asking for the Speaker's resignation without the hysterics, without the elevating this to a level that it didn't need to go. This is devastating all around. It's devastating for the Jewish community that is now harmed again by this, but it's also devastating for Ukrainians who, forever now, who this has been used by the Russians and Russia agenda, right? So the elevated discourse this week, I think, just makes a bad situation worse. And I don't think that that's a role that Canada wants to play. So I really liked Peter's approach this week. I thought it was reasonable. I thought it was diligent. And I just wish we would have seen that from a bit more of the politicians.
Well, Greg, what struck me about Peter Julian was that on the day when Rhoda rose in the House to apologize, on Monday before he quit, he was the first guy out say, "You got to go, man. You broke the trust." And he did it in a way that was measured and almost like it hurt him to ask for it. But he, right away, on a fundamental question of broken trust in Parliament, framed it, nailed it, and saw obviously what was coming.
And Julian did that without hysterics. And didn't make it about himself. David, I also, one of my, picks of the week is Peter Julian on a bigger topic. But, one of the things I was really disappointed, Michael Chong, who's considered a very principled MP, he's the person that quit cabinet when Prime Minister Harper made a decision that, really affected his entire mandate and portfolio, stepped away from cabinet. But this week he tweeted about how the Zelensky appearance in the House was, short notice. And I just kind of cringed at that because this is the president of a country at war. Like I said, I work out of an office building where Zelensky, I don't know if he was there. I cleared out on Friday. I didn't want to be around. I saw the rehearsals for the motorcade, high security. You do not advertise where a leader like that is going to be. We know that when we were involved in Afghanistan, reporters that would have covered, Prime Minister Harper's visits would have been embargoed for their own safety, let alone the Prime Minister's. So I saw some of that, which leads me, when you want to chat about my pick of the week, that was
just
the one that
go
really
for it. Yeah, tell us your pick. Tell us your pick. We'll just do the whole conversation.
I don't know how to say this, David, but I'm picking truth tellers. I worked on the Hill. The Speaker's office is sacrosanct. They have, it is, as someone said, I think last night on the At Issue panel, it's the MP's house. It's not the Prime Minister's house. And the MPs all get together and they decide who's going to be the Speaker. And what's interesting is Anthony Rhoda was Speaker due to the support of the Conservative caucus. I know that the Speaker makes this call. The Speaker came out and said that. But the Conservatives, and I dispute Fred on this, the Conservatives may have been very focused on this, but they also had a conversation at their convention about not getting too ahead of themselves, not to peak too soon. They invested a huge amount of energy and fuel this week for something that was entirely false. And who stood up for that? Peter Julian did. I'm surprised to say that I'm going to be picking the block and Blanchette. Blanchette said this is with the Speaker, and I think Susan Delacourt said earlier this hour that he had said he wanted an apology passed on behalf of himself. Right. I'm going to get high on my own supply here. David, you had somebody on your show. I've got a couple of CBC picks. Roy Norton, the former chief protocol officer for Canada. He had a great line. He said if he was asked, if he had asked for that list from, PMO in his day, he would have been told, quote, to take a hike. So I was glad to see those people stood up for truth. And then on another issue, there was a tabloid in Toronto that, repeated some allegations India is making about our Prime Minister and our trip. And Evan Dyer from CBC, did a tweet about how he was on that trip and how that was patently false. And probably took a lot of heat for it. So I think it's really important. We talked a couple of weeks ago about scrutiny and the leader of the Conservative Party. Those people who are still willing to stand up in the onslaught and to say, yes, this is the truth and we should stand by the truth, I think they deserve to be noted this week.
Right. Okay, and just some context on that article. This was a post-media report repeating claims by an Indian diplomat that the Prime Minister's plane in India, the problems were because it was full of cocaine. I have been on that plane. It is full of Mounties. It is full of air marshals. It is full of journalists. It is not full of coke. And the journalists who are on that trip, you corroborate that in the India case. So, Fred, I want to get back to you just after putting that context out there. Not surprisingly, our Liberal and New Democrat do not agree with how the Conservatives handled it this week. Do they have a point, or are they missing a political opportunity here that the Conservatives see that they can exploit?
Well, I have to wonder what the name of the show is, David. Is it Power and Feelings or is it Power and Politics? Because the Conservatives are playing politics, absolutely, and they are running circles around the other parties. Again, they have been focused on this. They've been going after Trudeau on it, demanding apologies when not warranted. This was the speaker's screw up. I totally believe that. But the Conservatives are doing this. They're hammering on it, and it's working for them. I think this is something where, Canadians, I think, ultimately believe right now that Trudeau is responsible for this. They don't know how politics works. They don't know how the House of Commons works generally. But what they're seeing is the Conservatives do a united message. And again, to the point, bringing up Mr. Chong, he's out there pushing the message, showing that the Conservative Party is united. All different factions, the moderates and the more further to the right, are all singing from the same tune book because it's working. And we're seeing that in the polling numbers.
No, David, look, I don't want to sound like I'm Pollyanna here, but like what Fred is saying is he's just confirmed what the Conservatives are pushing this week is entirely false. And if you build something on a false foundation,
Greg,
it will collapse.
It feels like a campaign, Greg, where you guys bring up all of these hot issues on us. You say we're going to allow everyone to have guns, and we're going to ban abortion, right? We're pushing back now. The Conservative Party is doing something I haven't seen them do in a decade.
Fred, were your feelings hurt when that happened? Were your feelings hurt?
Okay.
When that happened? I mean, it's like that's what I'm not following here. It's right when they do it and they're winning. I don't know. Earlier in the show, you talked about Manitoba, David, and how cruel those billboards were. Andrew Thompson, former Saskatchewan finance minister, said on your show last night, in Saskatchewan, what Mo is doing, the purpose of it is to be cruel. If cruelty equals conservatism, I don't think Canadians are going to buy it.
Right. So I don't know if that's necessarily the case, but Melanie, on what Fred is talking about, the effectiveness of the attack. We had Roy Norton on the show. By the way, I mistakenly called him Roy Horton last night. My apologies, Mr. Norton, because we like to do what I call like the Sesame Street interview, where you just like, how does this really work? Like, explain this to us. And he made it very clear, like, this is Anthony Rota's screw up, and there was no way around it for the PMO because that's just the way these things work. But as Fred makes a point, Mel, it can work to keep attacking Justin Trudeau because he's got to sort of clean up the international mess, and they seem to be having some success. Or do you think they're not having success with this?
No, I think Fred is right in that whether true or not, that the Prime Minister is wearing some of it. I think that's true. I also think it's true, though, that the styles of attack, while they may work with some folks, they definitely don't work with my parents. My parents who are watching this at home are not saying, hey, that Poilievre guy, he sounds really good on this. So if the goal is to discredit Justin Trudeau in a way that puts Poilievre forward as somebody who's prime ministerial, I don't think that was achieved this week. But I do agree with Fred that the Prime Minister is wearing some of it. So is that the Conservative goal? And if it is, then they were successful. If their goal is to elect Pierre Poilievre as Prime Minister in the next election, I don't think spending all week with the attacks that we saw Pierre Poilievre doing are going to move that yardstick, at least not in my universe.
So, Fred, help me out. Like, I get the political purpose in the attack, but there seems ample room to criticize without sort of delving into things that can be called false. You know what I mean? So why go there when, boy, there's plenty to hit with the brick bat already?
Well, look, Mr. Poilievre's reach is huge, the social media reach. So when he throws these punches, they do land now. He's grown this massive base across the country. So he can push this out. And, we're saying it's false. We're saying it's questionable. He could ask the question, did the Prime Minister do this? Was he aware of this? Those are fair questions. And there, a lot of Canadians really think that the Prime Minister is responsible for this. At the end of the day, again, this is playing politics. We all do this. Maybe I'm the only one that's being honest about it right now, but we all push different levels here. And maybe, we try to get our message across and to get people to vote for us. And that's what Poilievre is doing by diminishing the Prime Minister in people's eyes.
So Greg, I've heard your criticism of how the Conservatives have handled this. What's your take on how the government handled it, though? Waiting until Wednesday, taking all that time to get out there and deal with it in a formal, clear, and deliberate way.
Yeah, I found that curious as well. The only thing that I could kind of ascribe it to would be the fact that Anthony Rota should have resigned on Monday. People thought he ought to resign on Monday. And I don't know what the Prime Minister could apologize for if that speaker was still in the chair. I'm wondering if it's just as simple as logistics. The other thing, David, I'd just add is that the Conservatives have in their deputy leader a former speaker, Andrew Scheer. And I noticed that he's not saying that, the PMO, critiqued his invitations. He could, say the evidence is wrong, but then he would have to say, well, then, yes, I answered to Stephen Harper while I was speaker. So I noticed he's very quiet about whether or not, around the plausibility of Anthony Rota's explanation.
Okay, I can't let that go without Fred responding because I want to get Fred's take on that. So I apologize to the control room because I know I'm blowing time and I'm making your life difficult. But, Fred, on this point, Andrew Scheer was a former speaker. He knows how this works. What did you make of the arguments he laid out there this week? I mean, it's politics, but institutions work a certain way. I mean, shouldn't we just acknowledge that and say it?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, Parliament is supreme. The government is at their beck and order. I would say, if there was any world leader that came to Parliament when Prime Minister Harper was in power and Mr. Scheer was in the Speaker's chair, there probably were conversations had on who would be in the gallery.
Okay, so Mel, based on our understanding of the way it is supposed to work, I mean, would that have been appropriate? I know this is, when you look at it from the outside, right? President Zelensky, is there a bigger target on the planet right now? The security risk is a normal 20-car motorcade, drones and helicopters all over the city of Ottawa. But it does come down to this issue that the Speaker's office is distinct from everything. So just where are you on this argument?
Totally. I've been lucky enough, since my life in politics to sit in the House when we've had dignitaries come. When we had President Biden, I was lucky enough to sit there. I don't think that there was a big search done on my record when I was sitting in the room, right? So I just think of the work needed and necessary to vet every single person going into that chamber. When it's supposed to be Canadians' chamber, right? Like the ability for some people to go in and not go in. We'd have politicians who wouldn't be allowed to go in the House based on their criminal record, right? So I'm not saying that this shouldn't have been caught, but the process in itself is it's hard to figure out how to get it right so that this doesn't happen again. And just to your where we go next. To your question about how the government, your earlier question about how the government handled this, fair or not, I think they're going to wear this, and they're wearing this because it's been one thing after the next that they've been unable to get ahead of. And to your point of why did it take so long to answer this, that again just shows that they're slow on the uptake, slow at answering situations. So again, fair or not, I think this is going to be another mark against the government's inability to do things right.
Yeah, it's one of those issues, Fred, that even if it's not your fault, it becomes your problem. And I think that the challenge here in terms of the security vetting, a straight-up RCMP security vet of Mr. Hunka wasn't going to produce any red flags. He has no criminal record. He was allowed to come here legally. You can argue whether he should have, as B'nai B'rith and others want to know some answers on. I mean, without doing a full-blown, in-depth Google search of every person invited to these things, how do you avoid it?
You can't. But the opposition party can still punch you in the face for doing it. That's how this works.
He keeps coming back to that point, Greg, and he's not completely wrong. And he does equate it to what we see in election campaigns. Just a quick last 20 seconds to you, Greg, on how issues with a kernel of truth are presented as complete truth, right? And that becomes the challenge.
Yeah, we like to pride ourselves in Canada that our politics are different than the United States. But when we check it, when we look at it, even going back to the Kennedy years, there's about an 8 to 10 year lag on the style. And perhaps, Fred is right that it can happen. It's whether or not you want to be associated with those types of tactics. Okay, we got to end it there because I got extra time, but Andrew Nichols is not going to let me take him off the air, so I got to say goodbye to our Friday panel. Fred Delory, Melanie Richet, and Greg McEachern. Thanks so much, gang.